The American frontier was a wild place. In less than 70 years, the U.S. went from about 300,000 square miles that were the original 13 colonies to controlling the entire continental U.S. that we know today, gobbling up an astounding 2.8 million square miles of land. It's one of the largest, fastest land grabs in history. And the things that went down during this time were not for the faint of heart. The period was marked by near-continual warfare, often in impossible terrain. It took a certain kind of crazy to survive on the frontier. Today on Nutty History, we'll be discussing the filthy secrets of the Frontiersmen. The Wild Life of Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone is probably one of the most famous Americans in history. He was a legendary frontiersman who became immortalized over the years through books and movies. He helped open up the American frontier during the Revolutionary War when he discovered the Cumberland Pass into Kentucky. He blazed the Wilderness Road, another key passageway into the West, and through all of it, he had some pretty crazy adventures. And one of them is straight out of the plot of the movie Taken. It was 1776. Boone had established the town of Boonesboro a year earlier, and the Revolutionary War was in full swing. In July, Boone's daughter, Jemima, who was just 14 years old at the time, was taken captive along with two other young women, Betsy and Fanny Calloway. The girls were captured by a group of Shawnee warriors who had been sent by the British to harass and attack the American settlers in Kentucky. The girls were taken to a Shawnee village near present-day Chillicothe, Ohio, where they were held captive. Boone learned of this, and he wasn't pleased, to say the least. He and a group of men immediately set out in pursuit of the Shawnee kidnappers. They tracked the Shawnee to their village and carefully planned a surprise attack. On the third day of his daughter's captivity, Boone and his men tore into the village where the girls were being held, and they were able to rescue them, fatally shooting a few of the kidnappers in the process while the rest fled. The fact that Boone tracked down the kidnappers and rescued his daughter was yet another feather in his cap and proof of his wilderness skills. He had a particular set of skills.
But what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
Another pivotal point in Daniel Boone's life came a few years later. In 1778, during the American Revolution, the British teamed up with a couple of Native American tribes and began a series of attacks on American frontier settlements. One of these attacks was on Boonesboro. The siege of Boonesboro began in September 1778 when a large force of Shawnee warriors, led by a guy named Chief Blackfish with the support of British officers, surrounded the fort to lay siege to it. The settlers at Boonesboro were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were able to hold off the attack, for a while at least. But despite the settlers' best efforts, they eventually began to run low on supplies and ammunition. The situation became more desperate when several of the enslaved fighters who had been fighting alongside the settlers defected to the Shawnee, taking with them much-needed ammunition. Despite all the legends surrounding Daniel Boone, he was yet another early American settler who tolerated forced labor. Eventually, the settlers were forced to negotiate a surrender with the Shawnee. Boone and several other settlers were taken captive and held for several months. During his time with the Shawnee, Daniel Boone was treated pretty well, and he was even adopted into the tribe as the son of Chief Blackfish. Boone was actually given the name Sheltowee, which translates to Big Turtle, and he was allowed to hunt and fish with the tribe. He also learned the Shawnee language and customs, and he gained a deep appreciation for their way of life. But Boone couldn't come and go as he pleased. He was still a prisoner and was closely monitored by the Shawnee. Like any captive who knows his way around the woods and knows his way around a gun, Boone tried to escape. He slipped out of the village one night, but the Shawnee figured it out almost immediately, caught him, and brought him back. For his bad behavior, he had to run a gauntlet where he was stripped naked and forced to run between two lines of people who hit him with sticks as he went by. Boone survived the punishment, and he was eventually allowed to return to his family after several months in captivity. Boone's time with the Shawnee had a pretty big impact on him, and he later wrote about his experiences in his autobiography. He described the Shawnee as a brave and generous people, and he expressed admiration for their hunting and warrior skills, despite the fact that they hit him with a bunch of sticks and wouldn't let him leave for a while. Davy Crocket, Dirty Politics, and the ALAMO. What happens when a rough and gruff frontiersman becomes a U.S. representative, but then gets so disillusioned by the bureaucratic nonsense of it all that he can't stand it anymore? He says screw it, and he moves to Texas. This is the story of Davy Crocket. Now, you probably think of him as his coonskip cap-wearing, rifle-toting hunter-slash-wilderness guide, but there was a whole lot more to him than that. Crocket was born August 17, 1786 in eastern Tennessee, in what was then part of North Carolina. His parents were poor farmers and he grew up having to fend for himself quite often. By the time he was 18, Crocket struck out on his own and began working as a cattle driver, guiding herds of livestock through the wilderness to markets in Virginia and Georgia. He quickly gained a reputation as a skilled frontiersman and hunter, and became known for his sharpshooting skills and ability to survive in the wilderness. There's even one pretty wild story that's straight from the movie Revenant. The story goes that in the fall of 1825, Crocket was out hunting in the woods near his home in Tennessee when he came across a large black bear. Crocket fired a shot at it, but the bear was so big that it kept charging and knocked him to the ground. Crocket managed to draw his knife and engage in a hand-to-hand struggle with the bear. The two scrapped for several minutes, with Crocket puncturing the bear repeatedly until it finally succumbed to its injuries. According to the legend, Crocket suffered several injuries during the encounter, including a broken leg and multiple cuts and bruises. Whether the story is true or not is not really the point. The point is that Crocket was building up a pretty legendary persona that would eventually get him elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. A piece of publicity that helped rocket Crocket, you see what I did there, into the national spotlight was a play called The Lion of the West. The play's main character wasn't named Davy Crocket, but he looked and acted a whole lot like the Frontiersmen. The play, which premiered in 1831, was a satirical comedy that poked fun at frontier life and politics with a Crocket-esque main character. In the play, Crocket was portrayed as a larger-than-life figure, full of bluster and braggadocio, but also with a heart of gold. Aw shucks. The character's homespun humor and folksy charm resonated with audiences across the country and helped to cement Crocker's status as an American icon. The play was also significant because it coincided with the rise of Andrew Jackson. Crocket, who was initially a strong supporter of Jackson, was seen as a symbol of the rugged individualism and self-reliance that were prized by the Jacksonian Democrats. Crocket was a rising star, but he'd soon come to learn how low down and dirty politics could be. During his time as a U.S. representative from 1824 to 1835, Davy Crocket became increasingly frustrated with the political process in Washington. He was a member of the Whig Party, but he often clashed with party leaders and disagreed with their policies. One of Crockett's main frustrations was with what he saw as excessive government spending. He believed that the federal government was becoming too powerful and that it was wasting taxpayer money on unnecessary projects. He became particularly critical of President Jackson, despite the fact that the two were pretty good friends and allies initially. He came to realize how despicable Jackson actually was and how he was abusing his power and favoring his political allies over the interests of the country. The final straw that led to Crocket eventually leaving Congress and heading to Texas was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Crocket actually supported the act at first. He figured that the relocation would be beneficial for the Native Americans, since they'd be removed from the influence of white settlers and given new land to cultivate. He also saw it as a way to open up new land for white settlement and to further expand the United States. But as the debate over the Indian Removal Act continued, Crocket started having doubts. He received letters from his constituents expressing opposition to the forced removal of the Cherokee people who were living in his home state of Tennessee. He eventually became a vocal opponent of the act. In a famous speech to Congress, Crocket declared that the Indian Removal Act was unjust and that the government had no right to force Native Americans from their land. He argued that the Cherokee people had a right to their ancestral homeland and that they should be allowed to stay. Despite his opposition, the act was ultimately passed, which led to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans on the Trail of Tears. Disillusioned and pretty angry, Davy Crocket moved to Texas and got involved in the Texas fight for independence from Mexico. He arrived in San Antonio in early 1836 and joined a group of volunteers defending the ALAMO, an old Spanish mission that had been converted into a fortress. Crocket and his fellow defenders, which included some famous frontiersmen in their own right, including Jim Bowie, of Bowie knife fame, faced off against a Mexican army led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. The siege of the Alamo lasted for 13 days, with Crocket and the Texans holding out against overwhelming odds, outnumbered by more than 10-1. But on the morning of March 6, 1836, the Mexicans launched a final assault on the Alamo, and it all came crashing down. The final battle lasted less than 2 hours, and everyone defending the fort lost their lives, including Crocket. It's not entirely certain how Crocket bit the bullet. Some say he died as one of the final defenders in a heroic last stand. Others say he and the few remaining men surrendered and were executed soon after. Either way, it was a valiant bookend to one of the country's most interesting frontiersmen. Birth of the Oregon Trail and a new country. This next guy was one of the main reasons the Oregon Trail came to be, but his life was a controversial one. He thought of himself kind of like an 1800s freedom fighter who didn't think he had to answer to any government, and even tried to start his own country to prove it. John C. Fremont was a surveyor and explorer who eventually ran for president of the United States and attempted to create the short-lived independent Republic of California. Like many frontiersmen, his life was a weird one. In 1833, Fremont joined the Navy and became a math teacher on board the USS NATCHEZ. He spent the next few years exploring the coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, learning how to survey and chart new territories. He was discharged from the Navy in 1838 and moved to Washington, D.C., where he worked as an assistant to the chief clerk of the U.S. Bureau of Topographical Engineers. Fremont's early experiences in the Navy and the topographical engineers prepared him for his future career as an explorer and map maker. He learned how to navigate difficult terrain, make accurate measurements, and record his findings in detailed maps and reports. He eventually went out west, where he was instrumental in mapping out the Oregon Trail. He helped publicize the trail and even worked with Native American tribes to make sure relations between them and the new settlers moving along the trail were as peaceful as possible. Yet there were quite a few stories of Fremont's western expeditions not ending well for the Native Americans. In 1844, Fremont and his expedition took over a Native American village near the Great Salt Lake in Utah without permission. They destroyed the village and crops and killed several Native Americans. Later, during an 1845 expedition, Fremont and his men came across a group of Klamath Indians in California. When one of Fremont's horses was stolen, he ordered his men to attack the Klamath village, ending several people's lives and burning their homes. Despite his questionable treatment of Native Americans, Fremont was actually an abolitionist. In a lot of ways, he was really a confusing guy to pin down. Later in his life, when he became the first presidential candidate for the newly formed Republican Party, and then later when he was the governor of Missouri, he supported many abolitionist causes. But maybe the most famous came shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. It became known as the Fremont Emancipation. Fremont was then the military governor of Missouri, when he declared that all slaves owned by Confederates in the soon-to-be state should be free. It was an important step toward abolition in the state and was seen as a significant political move by Fremont, who was known for his cojones. The order was met with mixed reaction. Abolitionists and Unionists applauded the decision, while many slave owners and pro-Confederate sympathizers were outraged. President Abraham Lincoln was concerned about the legality of the order and its potential to drive Missouri, which was a border state, into the Confederacy. Lincoln also thought that military commanders, which was what Fremont was, didn't have the authority to issue proclamations of emancipation, and he feared that Fremont's actions would complicate efforts to keep the border states loyal to the Union. Lincoln was pragmatic, but still basically agreed with Fremont, but he asked Fremont to modify his proclamation. But Fremont refused. So Lincoln had it annulled and replaced Fremont with a new commander. They would later kiss and make up, and Lincoln appointed Fremont to a command in Virginia where he fought against the Confederacy. But one of Fremont's ballsiest and most controversial moves came 15 years earlier when he quite literally conquered California. But to get into that, we need to meet another significant frontiersman who helped him do it, Kit Carson. Kit Carson, Mountain Man. Kit Carson was an American frontiersman, a fur trapper, wilderness guide, Indian agent, and soldier. He was a man who wore a lot of hats. He was born on December 24, 1809, in Kentucky, and became famous for his adventures in the American West during the 19th century. He worked as a fur trapper and mountain man in the western frontier, where he built his skills at navigating the wilderness and dealing with Native American tribes. At the age of 16, Carson became an apprentice to a saddle maker, but quickly became restless and left to join a group of traders heading to Santa Fe, New Mexico. In Santa Fe, Carson became a fur trapper and mountain man, and he quickly gained a reputation as an expert guide and hunter. He spent much of his early career in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beavers and other fur-bearing animals. During this time, he also worked as a guide for expeditions into the frontier, including the 1829 to 1830 expedition led by Ewing Young and the 1832 to 1833 expedition led by Captain Benjamin Bonneville. He would go on to have a storied career in the military, particularly during the Mexican-American War, and then later during the Civil War, where he fought for the Union. Carson would become one of the most famous frontiersmen of this time, thanks to a series of dime novels called The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. Dime novels were cheap, kind of gossipy, often sensationalized little books that just about anyone could afford to read. Carson's dime novel series, written by a guy named DeWitt C. Peters, ran from 1843 to 1897 and helped establish Carson as a legendary figure in the American folklore. He was later portrayed in a bunch of other films and television series, including the 1940 film Kit Carson, in which the brave Kit helps defeat a group of Native Americans attacking a wagon train. You can even find him in the 2010 video game Red Dead Redemption. The Conquest of California. Finally, let's get into how Carson and Fremont teamed up and briefly conquered California. Kit Carson and John C. Fremont met for the first time in 1842 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Fremont was leading an expedition to explore and map the Western Territories, and he hired Carson as a guide. What happened next was one of the strangest stories of the American frontier. Towards the end of 1845, Fremont, Carson, and the rest of their expedition arrived in California and began making contact with American settlers and other foreigners who were living there. At the same time, tensions between Mexican authorities and American residents was already high, and Fremont's arrival only added to the unease. Carson played a key role throughout their time in California, serving as a scout and messenger for Fremont. He also helped to capture the town of Sonoma, which served as the headquarters for what would become known as the Bear Flag Revolt. Fremont eventually met with a group of American settlers in Sonoma, where they discussed the possibility of declaring independence from Mexico. Fremont was cautious at first about getting involved in any overtly political activities, but he did provide the settlers with weapons and ammunition from his own supplies. On June 14th, the rebels raised the Bear Flag, a symbol of their independence, and declared the establishment of the California Republic, with Fremont as their leader. Many of you probably know the flag they raised pretty well. It was this one, complete with a star, a bear, and the words California Republic. The revolt was short-lived, though. The U.S. Army quickly swooped in and took control of the region as part of the larger war effort against Mexico. The Bear Flag Revolt had significant consequences for the future of California and the United States. It helped to establish American control over the region and paved the way for California to become a state in 1850. It also marked the beginning of a long history of conflict and tension between American settlers and indigenous peoples in California. There were a few reasons why Fremont got in trouble. First off, he was a private citizen and didn't have official authorization from the U.S. government to carry out any military operations in California. He took it upon himself to lead a group of American settlers and military forces in California to revolt against the Mexican government and declare an independent republic. This action was viewed by many as illegal and unauthorized, and Fremont was subsequently court-martialed for mutiny and insubordination. Fremont was also criticized for his brutality towards Mexican civilians and Native American tribes, and Fremont himself was accused of executing prisoners without trial. Fremont's role in the whole thing was obviously pretty controversial, and like I said, he was eventually court-martialed for insubordination and mutiny. But he claimed that he hadn't participated in the rebellion, despite a whole lot of evidence to the contrary. It worked out for Fremont, though. As we mentioned earlier, he became an influential general and politician who eventually ran for president. The Oregon Trail made Butch Cassidy. The Oregon Trail, the one that John C. Fremont helped create, was a treacherous journey that wasn't for the faint of heart. Over the course of America's westward expansion, an estimated 1 in 10 people lost their lives trying to find better lives in the West, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 in total. That's about 20 graves per mile. There were a few factors that contributed to the high mortality rates on the trail. Accidents, freezing cold weather, and attacks by Native Americans were just a few of them. Many people also suffered from malnutrition and dehydration. It was difficult to carry enough food and water for the long journey, and a lack of medical care meant that any infection was a possible death sentence. But one famous Wild West figure owes his life to the Oregon Trail. His parents met on it. Butch Cassidy, while not really a frontiersman, was definitely one of the most infamous personalities of the time. The bank and train robber was born in Utah in 1866 to Mormon parents who just barely made it there. According to the legend, Cassidy's parents, Maximilian Parker and Anne Campbell Gillies, both immigrated to the United States from Scotland in the mid-19th century. They met on the Oregon Trail, where they were both part of a group of Mormon pioneers traveling to the Salt Lake Valley. The group they were with almost didn't make it. They were part of what became known as the Mormon Handcart Tragedy. The Mormon Handcart Tragedy was a series of events that occurred during the mid-19th century as Mormon pioneers traveled westward to Utah. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints encouraged its members to use handcarts instead of the traditional covered wagons, because the handcarts were cheaper, but it turned out to be a bad move. In 1856, 2 companies of Mormon handcart pioneers left Iowa City, Iowa, and headed for Salt Lake City, Utah. There were about 1,000 of them in total. They didn't time the journey very well and had to face a harsh winter as they crossed the Wyoming plains. They also had to haul their handcarts and also didn't have much in the way of supplies. So many of the pioneers became sick and weak from the conditions. As their food and supplies dwindled, some of the pioneers resorted to eating the leather from their shoes and belts to survive. The pioneers pressed on though, and some were able to reach safety in Utah. But more than 200 of them died as a result of the harsh weather and lack of supplies, and many others suffered from frostbite and other injuries. Luckily for Cassidy, though unluckily for the people he killed and the owners of the banks and trains he robbed, his parents made it through the ordeal. Sacagawea. No story about America's frontiersmen would be complete without mentioning their most important guides. Sacagawea was perhaps one of the most famous guides of one of the most famous frontier expeditions in history, the expedition of Lewis and Clark. Sacagawea had a pretty harrowing childhood. She was born into the Lemhi Shoshone tribe. Some call them the Lemhi Shoshone tribe in what's now Idaho around 1788. But when she was about 10 years old, a group of HIDATSA warriors raided her village and captured her and several other girls. The HIDATSA were a neighboring tribe to the Shoshone, and they really didn't get along. What happened next gets a bit foggy, but according to some accounts, Sacagawea was sold to a French-Canadian trader named Toussaint Charbonneau and his wife, who was a HIDATSA named Otter Woman. Charbonneau had been living among the HIDATSA and had already taken Otter Woman as his wife, but he was open to having options and was apparently in the market for a second wife who could speak Shoshone and HIDATSA and could help him navigate the West. Another story suggests that Charbonneau won Sacagawea in a game of chance, either dice or cards, from the group of HIDATSA men who had captured her. In this version, Charbonneau wasn't looking for wife number 2, but instead saw an opportunity to use Sacagawea's language skills to his advantage. Regardless of how it happened, Sacagawea became Charbonneau's wife and accompanied him on his travels throughout the West. When the Lewis and Clark expedition arrived at the HIDATSA village in 1804, they hired Charbonneau as an interpreter and guide, and Sacagawea joined them on their journey. She was a vital piece of the expedition. She helped translate and communicate with other tribes they encountered along the way. She even crossed the Rocky Mountains while pregnant. Give that a try sometimes and see how it goes. And if it were not for Sacagawea, many of the documents from the expedition, including maps and journals, could have been lost forever. The story goes that the expedition was traveling down the Missouri River when their boat, which was carrying important documents, supplies, and instruments, capsized in rough waters. The boat and its contents were quickly swept away by the current. But Sacagawea sprang into action. She was traveling on another boat with her infant son, saw what happened, jumped to the bank of the river, and quickly gathered up as much of the stuff as she could. Were it not for the Shoshone guide, Lewis and Clark might have had to redo the whole expedition, or else some other dynamic duo would have, and we'd be saying their names right now instead. These are just a few stories of the frontiersmen who helped shape America. What else do you want to know about them? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.